My name is not Vince. My name is Mr. McMahon.
On today's show, we'll be reviewing the first 3 episodes of the 6-episode Mr. McMahon docuseries that recently premiered on Netflix. We'll discuss the major moments from each episode, plus share our reactions to all of the new things that we learned about the former CEO and chairman of WWE. But before we get to any and all of that, we're kicking off this podcast by welcoming some very special guests who are going to help us break down this brand new documentary. I am so excited about this. Today, we are joined by the ladies of Those Wrestling Girls, Queen PR, and Krista B. Welcome to Two Black Nerds. How y'all feeling today?
We're good. Thank you for having us.
Feeling good. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to have you guys here. You two are real wrestling experts, pro wrestling experts. We had to bring on the best of the best to talk about this brand new docuseries because there's a lot to break down here. There's a lot to get to. So definitely had to lean on some people who were very in tune, obviously, with this world that we know have been fans, pretty much for your entire lives. Before we dive into the doc, I do have I guess a fun question to start off with. I want to know from each of you, what is your earliest wrestling memory? If you can recall like your very first memory of pro wrestling, it can be something you watched or a conversation that happened, whatever it may be. I just want to know, like, what was that very first memory that you can recall about your connection with pro wrestling? Krista, maybe we can start with you.
My very first wrestling memory was Survivor Series 96 and seeing The Rock debut. And he was the blue chipper, the blue with the pineapple, whatever going on. And I remember he was Soul Survivor in his match. And then going back, I remember him talking about it. He was like, he was looking the wrong way at the camera. Like he was looking at the hard cam when he won. He just kept talking to the audience behind him instead of like in front of the camera in front of him. But yeah, that was like really my first intro to pro wrestling, was seeing The Rock wrestle, and then, going on like the whole die Rocky die situation. So anything with The Rock, I'm there. And I see your shirt, Des. See your shirt.
Definitely. Big.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Love it.
P, what about you?
I love it. So my first wrestling memory was of Diesel and Bret Hart. Like I was young though, like probably like 6 years old, and that was like the first time my dad tried to get me to watch wrestling, and I was just like, he threw Diesel threw Bret Hart into the announce table, and as a kid, I was just like, oh my god! And the fact that like everything just kept moving, like nobody was like, and I was just like, oh my god, like this is fucking barbaric. Like what the fuck do you have me? Like I remember being so traumatized, and then as I kept watching it, and the story, became more about like the storyline. That's when I got into it. But that's like my very first.
It's crazy how these random acts of violence, like they just happen, and then we just proceed to the next thing. Like we just keep it going. It's like, okay, big deal. Somebody just like got
wait, this man just
right
through a table, and like we're not even gonna do it.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Des, I don't think I've asked you this yourself. I'm curious. Like now that we're talking about it, do you remember your first wrestling memory?
I don't even know if I have an answer because everything is so jumbled. I was so young. I will say it's not necessarily my own memory, but apparently back when the tragic passing of Owen happened, I was there apparently in the arena. It happened in Kansas City. So apparently I was there. So I would say that's pretty early. I had to be like 5. You know what I mean? I was pretty young. So I'm gonna just go with that. Again, not a specific. I don't really remember being there, but apparently I was there. So
here's something crazy about that. We have never talked about that, and you probably were there. I was at the show the next night in St. Louis, the Raw is Owen show.
Wow.
That was like maybe the second or third like live event that I went to, and I remember distinctly like how important that was, just because like this wrestler passed. Obviously, it was a big deal and really tragic, which is something that is covered in this docuseries that we're going to get into today and talk about. I know that this was something that was like eagerly anticipated, of course, amongst the wrestling community, the pro wrestling community, and obviously just due to the fact of like what's surrounding it, just all of the controversy, the news, and what's happened with Vince McMahon over the past few years. It was something certainly that I think people had their eyeballs on and wondered, how is this gonna come across? Like, how are we approaching this story about this really important historical figure, but also somebody who has clearly done some really atrocious things allegedly from what we're seeing, you know, in the reports and all of those things. But you know, there's a lot to get to, so I don't want to waste any more time. And I do want to, you know, warn audiences that are listening or watching, if you've not watched the docuseries, we're going to be spoiling details. So I would encourage you to go watch it if you've not, and then, you know, finish out the rest of our conversation. But let's start with some big picture thoughts. You know, what did people think about the docuseries as a whole? How did you feel about it before we dive into the specifics? And P, I'll start with you on this question. How did you overall feel about this new Mr. McMahon docuseries?
So when I first heard about it, I felt like it was the best news like I could ever get, because I just like really love documentaries and wrestling documentaries. And even more so because now everybody has a podcast, like everybody is just chatting all the time, but like we've never heard from Vince McMahon, like who he is. So when I heard that he was a part of it, like it wasn't like somebody telling his story, like he was like, no, this is, I want to be a part of it. He was going to be interviewed, he wanted to tell his story. I was extra interested. And he's just a fascinating, like even with all of the controversies, like he's still a very fascinating person to me. Like it's like he's one of one. There's no one else that could have brought wrestling to where it is. So like I always wanted to learn like who he was as a person. And then all that shit happened, and it wasn't gonna happen, and then it did, and I was just like so excited to hear it, like that it was still happening, and it lived up to my expectations.
Absolutely. Krista, what about you?
Okay, so I liked the documentary. I did like the documentary. I thought it was going to be like, oh my God, we're actually getting to know who Vince is. But in the beginning, he started off with, I'm just gonna sit here and do this, and y'all still not gonna know who I am. Like he didn't give us like a clean cut version of who Vince McMahon really is. I felt like the documentary low key fell short to my standards, because a lot of the stuff that he said in the very beginning, most of us who was already in tune to Vince McMahon, we already knew. We already knew the things that happened with his dad and things that happened with his mother, and you know there were certain things in there that I was just like, oh shit, I didn't know this. Like Jordan, me and you was talking at work, we was just like, we ain't going to discredit this person and that person. But I just honestly feel like there were some things that could have been explained more, or we could have really took a deeper dive into um Vince McMahon, like Vince McMahon outside of wrestling, like who he was at home, who he, like we saw bits and pieces of that, but I just feel like it should have been more. Like you literally you semi took the veil off from over our eyes and then just put it right back on, and that was it. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, that I think a lot of people wondered if that was going to be the case. Like, how much is he really going to open himself up to exposing just his life and being a bit more vulnerable? And it was interesting to see how that came across in the doc. Des, what about you? We haven't talked about it yet, you know, on the pod or outside of the pod. What did you think about the whole docuseries?
Yeah, it was fine, man. You know, I think, you know, Crystal was onto something where I think there was that you could tell there were always glimpses of brilliance where the documentary was like, oh man, I didn't know this thing about him, but it was too far and in between a lot of the times. What I do like about it though is it's such a clean timeline of how everything went down. That's one of my favorite parts about it. It does serve as like a, I don't know, like almost like a history book in some ways of the WWE, just because we're following Vince McMahon. So I liked being able to just, I guess, put the pieces together in order. Not a lot of things you're going to be able to do that, right? Like a lot of times we have to recall on our own, like, yo, you remember in '96 this thing happened, you remember it? And I think I really like how it was like, no, this thing is legit in order from when Vince as a kid to how we got here now. So I did like those aspects of it, but there was, I think I did need a little bit more from the Vince McMahon, who he is, kind of outside WWE. I know it sounds crazy because that's what this whole thing is, but there was always like, oh my God, Vince McMahon did this thing for my wife when she had cancer, and then you're like, okay, but like, can I get something else like that on camera, or can I get him talking about some of those experiences, Vince McMahon? Can I get some of that stuff outside of you know, WWE? And again, they talked about when they started talking about his kids. It's like, oh yeah, that stuff is interesting, but go a little bit more in depth. I would have liked some of that stuff more in depth. So it was a fine overall. A lot of things I did like, but it was, yeah, I just needed a little bit more from it, I think.
Yeah, it was a really so it's a tough position to work from because diehard fans, like all of us are hardcore fans, we've seen a lot of documentaries. There's so much out there. There's already been so much that's been told, and I know the producers behind this, they wanted to tell a story that felt accessible, for the casual fan who might not have been in tune with wrestling, who might have fell off during the Attitude Era or whatever the case may be. And from that standpoint, I think it's pretty successful because Des, like you said, it gives a great overall sort of 50,000 foot view of the history of WWE. And that's inextricably tied in with Vince. That really is his life story. But I think for a lot of people who will tune in, who do keep up with this and are very ingrained in this world and in this culture, it definitely, I think, would leave a lot of people disappointed just because a lot of the topics that are covered here, there's like whole other documentaries about several topics, right? Like many of these things have been covered in A Dark Side of the Ring or Wrestling with Shadows, like things that have happened, throughout the years. And so when you only spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes on the subject, you have to piece together things quickly and then kind of move on. So they throw a lot at you. I do think it's really, really well made. I think the production team and very much well made, like who they got in front of the camera, the editing of it, the pacing of it, that stuff was amazing. I think it's definitely one of the better docs.
The titles of the episodes too.
Yes,
because
good point.
Not a lot of documentary series do that. They'll do like episode 1, 2, 3, chapter 1, 2, 3, but every episode like went with what the every title went with what the episode was about. Like the first one, Junior. The second one, I think, was
Heat. Yep.
Heat, yeah.
Heat, and the third was Screw Jobs. And I was like, that's such a perfect way to like kind of put a chapter name on like all of like Vince's eras almost.
Yeah. Even the last one, calling it finish is like a double entendre too, because that's like, finishing wrestling. So yeah. Go ahead, Krista. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say I agree because as you guys all pointed out, it does give a clean, concise timeline. So with every title of each episode, it's a clean and concise. Like a person who has never watched wrestling before or who has forgotten, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, so this makes sense," because people may have just heard of the Montreal screw job but never heard of the Wendy Richter screw job, which I never heard of. I knew about it. I knew that it was the same situation like Brett and Sean with Wendy and Moolah. Like she didn't want to drop the belt, so I understood it, but I never looked at it as a screw job until it was blatantly put out in black and white. Like, yeah, Wendy Richter got screwed over, so it's the Richter screw job. So I like to P's point, I do like how the titles are synonymous with that episode, and it sticks with that episode. Like it doesn't jump back and forth.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thematically, they did about as good as a job you can do trying to cover 50 years.
Yeah.
It's like
agreed.
this is a massive undertaking. So yeah, I definitely don't want to discredit any of that work that went into it. Let's get into the first episode, which I think, a lot of it kind of speed runs through, Vince's childhood, him taking over the company from his father, the whole territory situation, ultimately sort of culminating in WrestleMania 1, right? And so the thing that continued to be brought back up throughout the entire docuseries that I felt like was really well established in this first episode is that relationship with his father, right? And how I think on the outside looking in, it feels like, oh, it's this really loving relationship and he looked up to his father and he continued the family business. But as you watch this, and you learn, okay, he didn't even meet him until he was 12 years old. He didn't learn about his last name, and he was in an abusive relationship with his stepfather at the time. Him and his mother were a bit estranged. We learned some stuff there, or maybe relearned some stuff there, but really like the Vincent J. McMahon relationship with the Vincent, Jr., that we know, it felt like it wasn't that loving, and it felt like his father may have made it really hard for him to break into the business and ultimately kind of wrestle, no pun intended, wrestle the business away from him and take control. P, how did you feel about just that sort of taking place in the beginning and really just establishing and giving us, I think, a better view into who he is as a person and how that influences actions throughout his life?
I think that goes to like some of the criticisms about the doc about how it's like so WWE centric and we don't know who Vince is outside of that. And I think the point is that there is no other side. Like that is who he is. Like he met his dad as the big promoter king of New York. Like that's how he met his dad at 12 years old. So like your whole like those formative years of getting to know his father is being in that wrestling world and wanting to be that. So like that's who he is like at his core in my opinion. So hearing that like, you know, Mr. McMahon, that's the name of the doc, and the fact that you didn't even know you were McMahon till you were 12. Like to me, like that is like so wild to me. And you can't talk about Vince McMahon's story without talking about his dad, because even a lot of like the wrestlers that were like gatekeepers back in the day and like only knew him, like Roddy Piper, for example, or like even Andre the Giant, like those relationships were formed with his father.
Mm.
And it was just like he kind of inherited those relationships. So I like that the first episode was called Junior, because you could really get a sense of like the history of wrestling, what that meant for Vince, and also, and this, you know, don't fucking meet your heroes disappointing you these days, because you want to, like, I want to be proud of what Vince McMahon was able to accomplish, because his father didn't want him anywhere near the business, and how he literally started from the bottom of the wrestling industry and worked his way up to like, you know, being innovative and taking risks and taking chances. Like that's something that I wish that we can like be proud of, because it wasn't easy for him to do all of that stuff, especially like having like no identity before 12, like, you know, and then be able to build the empire that he did, and then get that, the vulnerability you guys are talking about. Like he almost cried talking about his dad saying, finally telling him that he loved him before he died. Like I don't think we've ever seen anything like that when it came, like I've never heard that, and I've probably read every book about Vince that there is, and I'm like, I never heard that story of him talking about like, you know, how that was fulfilling for him. But the first episode was a perfect like start to the story.
For sure, for sure. Krista, what do you think about just like how they established that and ultimately I think tied that thread throughout a lot of the themes that came back up, especially with his own family later in the docuseries?
One, I want to say back to P's point, like Vince not knowing he was a McMahon until 12. Like that, you got to be one badass person to not know you're a McMahon, and then literally change your name, take that name and run it, and become one of the most powerful people in this industry, like in this wrestling industry. To whatever his name was before, sorry to that man, because we don't know him. We know Vince McMahon, you know. So that right there should have just shown or been pointed out, like this man is gonna be something or be somebody. Like he's gonna have some type of power, because for you to take the like, let's be honest, like if you meet a strange parent at 12 years old and you don't know what you're going into, you're not going to want to sit there and take their last name, no matter how powerful, whatever. Like some people want to see what their dynamics are between a father and son, a mother and daughter, or however have you. But for you to have this American dream tail in your head, like your father's going to welcome you with open arms and you're going to be like the best of friends. And when you found out that's not what it was, and you still went on and used his last name as your last name, like it's just like he just knew, like manipulation at its finest at this point. Um, but I do like how, you know, they like I said before, certain things I already knew when it came down to Vince and his father, but it was other things that I'm just like, yeah, like the part where he did cry when he was like his father it took him all that while for his father to say that he loved him. And then it goes to, not trying to jump, but then it goes to him like doing the same, but not doing the same to Shane, until Shane almost broke his ass off that damn Hell in a Cell with Undertaker. Like,
Validate your kids, people, so they know how
yes,
to
validate your
fucking
children. And not
Right.
just like
approval.
dad's just not your
Facts.
daughters, and
Stop
mom's
the
just not
cycle.
your son. Validate all of them. Yeah. But I do like how it all does come together. It all comes together. And that Vince is still here now to tell not only his children, but his grandchildren that he loves them and that he's proud of them. Because Vince Sr. probably didn't really get that chance to. He died at 60, I believe, like in his earlier mid
Pretty
60s.
young.
Yeah,
Oh
so he
wow.
didn't get that chance. So I do like how, you know, it does come full circle for Vince, and how even though Vince was still looking for that validation, he was still that little boy who was like, I get to work with my dad every day. I get to do this for him.
Mm. Yeah, no, for sure. Des, a lot of this is also Vince getting the company, buying it from his father, and then taking the company in a completely different direction than what his father had envisioned, and ultimately carrying out what we know would be the mainstream sort of the mainstream effect of what WWF would be, the nationalization of it. And in order to do that, he had to steal talent from other territories. He had to go and bring them in to really expand it. But it was also, something that created, I think, even more of a point of contention between him and his father, because his father had good relationships with all of these people. And then we ultimately hear Vince kind of tell a story like, well, then I eventually got my father's approval because he saw how successful it was. He finally said, like, yeah, you did a great job with that, even though initially he might not have believed that. How did you feel about just that telling of that story? Because again, I think sometimes throughout the years with WWE documentaries, sometimes they paint a bit of a different picture in terms of like how this all happened. But the reality is a lot of people lost jobs. Their territories were put out of business. Their families probably had to go through some really tough times while Vince was furthering his vision to make this a more national and ultimately a global enterprise, and what he did with the 80s.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most it's just a complicated thing at the end of the day, right? They talked about it throughout the whole documentary, but Vince is such a business guy and a businessman. And while it's so weird as a wrestling fan, because while simultaneously I think recognizing that, like you said, he put people out of jobs. There was a ton of wrestlers and talent all over the states. Again, he's breaking all of these wrestling territories, and people are losing jobs while that's happening. At the same time, he's also revolutionizing what the wrestling industry is going to end up being to what we know and love today. And it's such a weird thing, I think, to have to grapple with and to even look at. But even on the poster it says like what? It's like mastermind and madman. It's like you literally, Vince is literally constantly the good and the bad all the time, like that. And that's really what this documentary is. It's like here's a bunch of good stuff he did, a genius, and then here's on the other hand, you definitely did some things that a lot of people are not going to like, and so, or a lot of people don't like, or you affected their lives in this way. And so it's been very interesting, I think, to see that. But like you said, they paint a different picture because they kind of have to, right? Like you can't be like, man, we shouldn't have done this, or you can say that, right? You can't take accountability, I think, in that way. But there is a business standpoint that's like, we revolutionized this thing, not necessarily we kind of also messed up a lot of people's worlds in this way as well. So that's kind of, I think, the whole point of this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. And the setup and the payoff for that, when the whole WCW conversation comes in later about them ultimately taking his talent away from them, and him repositioning himself as an underdog, right? And him repositioning himself as a sympathetic figure when, 10 years prior, my guy, you were doing the same thing to Vern Gagne and to Deep South and all these other territories. Like you were kind of doing the same exact thing, but now the tables have turned. I want to go to episode 2 entitled Heat. And one of the key things here, this is a story that's been told a lot, but we finally got some clarity about it. Hulk Hogan is obviously a big fixture throughout these first few episodes. Like he's a mainstay, and obviously very complicated feelings about Hogan throughout the years. Well, they're not really that complicated anymore. It's pretty clear cut how I feel about him. But one of the things that he finally admits to is this whole story related to the Wrestlers Union. Jesse Ventura tried to start a union for professional wrestlers before WrestleMania 2. So WrestleMania 1, huge success. They're all going on the road even more now. They're traveling. They're out on the road 300 days a year. It's a grind. And before WrestleMania 2, when they still have, I guess, some leverage, Jesse Ventura tries to create and organize a union to protect them. And ultimately, Hulk Hogan goes to Vince, snitches out Ventura, and basically that whole thing gets shut down. And I mean, pretty much since then, that's not really even been a conversation on the table. Like wrestlers, like it's been a conversation, but it's not been a reality. Like wrestlers unionizing, and it's such a hard thing to even grasp now because it's gotten more complicated. Krista, what did you feel about that moment? Like Hogan ultimately owning up to what he did, because he's kind of hid that fact for a while, but also just like the bigger implications for like how it changed wrestling and how it changed the protections against talent and some of the things they have to deal with today, just like the grind and the schedule of what it takes to be a superstar.
So, funny story, real quick. I was watching it at work, and I went to Jordan, and I was like, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but you're going to have even more of another reason to hate Hogan. And it was just like another one, like, There's not like Hayden Hogan. It should be like an Olympic sport at this point, right? Because everybody hates him for one reason or another. But then to hear that he was the reason why the wrestlers didn't unionize, and mind you, he's over here talking about, oh, I had 23 surgeries in however many months, and people are telling me that it's fake. However, because of those surgeries and those injuries, when you was off camera, you weren't getting paid. And because of you ratting out the whole idea that Jesse Ventura had, it ultimately set up the fact that when these people got injured and they knew they was gonna be off TV and not get paid, it set up them working through their injuries. I'm pretty sure it set up a lot of their drug addictions. It set up a lot of them dying young because they didn't have the proper care because you wanted to be the rat, and instead of you going and thinking of like the full plan, like how this can really benefit you in the end, you turn around and now half the friends you wrestled with are gone at young ages. Like it just didn't make sense. Like, or even if he was to say something, it should have been brought up like, hey, we should do this just in case. So not only are you still making money for your company, but if you lose us as wrestlers, we can still solidify us as our own. I feel like because Hogan didn't come up with the idea, he ain't like it. That's how I feel. If it was his idea,
he was
he probably would have
his spot. Because if
that's what I'm saying. Like,
then Hulk Hogan will be on the same level as everyone else. Like everyone will have to be paid the same. You can't have a union in an opinion-based sport. Like it just doesn't make sense. Like you can have better healthcare plans, you can have better this, but a union, it wouldn't make sense. Even regardless if Hulk Hogan snitched, it wouldn't have happened. But the fact that he finally admitted that he snitched, I literally screamed because it's been like on the fucking dirt sheets and the shoot interviews for years of other wrestlers being like, I know Hogan snitched, and him being like, no, I didn't. And then he finally said, I stooged.
He finally said it.
I went right and told Vince immediately. I said, yo!
I love how they did that cut scene when everybody's like, Hogan told. Hogan was like, yeah, I told.
He
I'm
snitched.
like, you.
Like, so obvious, and it's like
you can't lie now.
Hogan be doing, it'd be lying.
It'd be lying.
and
Hogan,
like,
stay lying. He stay lying.
Stay lying.
He stay lying. So the fact that he admitted it, I was shocked.
Yeah.
I was just like,
it was a pretty crazy thing to witness. Yeah, it's like maybe he's making steps now. Maybe he's like seeing kind of the error of his ways. I might be giving him way too much credit. I won't do that any longer. But it was definitely like a big point that I think a lot of people just a little something. But it was a crazy thing to see. But then they also, they have to get into, I think, the beginnings of, what would be like these big scandals that Vince would ultimately be kind of at the center of, and a lot of what this episode set up, especially for 3, but, starting in 2 was, by the 90s, Hogan, his popularity is starting to wane. They talked through the WrestleMania 3 story. We've heard that, a million times, but now they're starting to see some of these scandals come about, around this time. And Vince is starting to kind of feel the pressure, in particular from Phil Mushnick, who was a part of this documentary, who was a writer for the New York Post. And at that time, appeared to kind of be the only guy who was really reporting on anything happening within the wrestling world. And I'm amazed that they sat him down for this, but I'm so glad that he decided to participate, because for so long, wrestling journalism wasn't covering it in this way. But, Mushnick came on and he's like, I'm writing this because like the guy's a dirtbag. He literally called him a dirtbag on this documentary, and ultimately admitted to being an FBI informant as well, which I did not know. That was a crazy revelation.
Tell people that.
Yeah, right. Like
I didn't even know you could say that to people.
Right.
I said, oh,
are you safe?
Take that to the grave. It was crazy, but yeah. Des, what did you think about that? Just because I think that was where we started to see, like, okay, WWF is starting to be hugely successful. People love it. It's taken off. But now we gotta balance this out, and we got to start to really dig in. And once that spotlight increases, once Vince becomes kind of the center of this company in taking everything mainstream, well, he's also now susceptible to anything that goes down, whether he's guilty or not.
Right. Yeah. I mean, That's how it goes when you're the face of something, right? You automatically you guilty by management. You know, you're just guilty by association. You're guilty by management. Your face is on everything. You are carrying the torch for whatever happens to the company at that point. And so he is liable for everything that was happening. And Phil Mushnick, he's like, so they're not gonna be held accountable for nothing.
Right.
Like nothing is happening. So Mr. Snooker over here, that just goes away. Like not that, you know, that's probably one of the first red lights he's seen. Like, oh no, all right, it's time to get down to business. Cause I think, you know, of course at this time too, we are deeply embedded in what white patriarchy looks like. And so there's all of these things not being paid attention to, all of these things nobody's talking about. Phil Mushnick's like, no, somebody has to talk about this stuff, or else people are going to get hurt, or people are going to continue to get hurt, or they're going to be able to continue to do this thing with zero accountability. So I'm going to start talking about it. And so, man, it's a crazy, I think, place to be in for sure. Because I can imagine being Vince McMahon, like if my wrestlers don't get themselves together, I'm sure he felt like that at some point in time, as well as he was doing his own dirt. But it's you gotta clean up shop, and you gotta take care of home, and they don't do that because he felt like he had the privilege to not have to do that, and so that's where Phil Mushnick comes in, man.
Yeah, and I think too, Meltzer, you know, he alluded to it later in the docuseries. He said, like, you know, nobody really took any of these scandals all that serious because wrestling is this fake thing. It's not real, you know. Therefore, the crimes themselves, we shouldn't take them seriously. Reporters didn't really want to cover that world. They didn't want to have to even learn about it. They didn't want to have to learn about the culture and the lingo and just like how different it is compared to mainstream society. And so Phil Mushnick was kind of the only guy that was like, I'm going to call all of this out because there's a lot of stuff in this underbelly that's just not right.
Yeah.
And one of them being was the story of Rita Marie, the lady referee that they brought up in this episode. P, I want to get your thoughts on this just because I don't know if I've heard about this story. I can't recall if I ever have. Maybe I have, and it just, you know, got swept under the rug, or it was like a footnote in another story. But this was a crazy thing where you have somebody who claims that they were raped, sexually assaulted by Vince, went very public with it, you know, appeared on shows and everything.
And
exactly, you know,
took her seriously. And
Nobody
I
believed
read
her.
one book about Vince, and he did the typical thing, like invite her inside his limo and basically was like, you know, if you want your career to go further, you're gonna have to do this and that. And she had to like fight him off. Like, it was kind of like, it's crazy when you think about it. And she did everything right. And it just goes to show you where society was at the time, because the media blamed her. Like the people that were interviewing her on a fucking a night, like a primetime show, is literally victim blaming her on national television, painting her as a gold digger, and like, you know, why are you trying to stir up trouble? And I'm looking at this and this, you know, the lens of 2024, and I'm just like, this girl is literally, you know, sharing her story, and we're literally not taking her seriously. Like, wild. And it's also just sad too, because like now it's like dope to be like, oh my god, we got female referees. Like, that is so cool. Like, now it feels like a thing. But imagine back then, when there was probably no women in the locker room. The only woman probably in the locker room at that time was probably like Miss Elizabeth, and that's because she was with a wrestler. And now you have this referee in the ring on the same level as these men. Like, that should have been such a dope moment. And then unfortunately, you know, something like that happens to her. So that was unfortunate. But like the nostalgic of like columns, like I love that part of the doc. Or like even like those like Phil Donahue. I'm like, Phil Donahue show. Like,
it's a
I
throwback.
remember my grandmother watching that shit in like the 90s, and I'm like, oh, Vince was on that. Like, it was so just wild to me, just like like how media has changed, and how, like you said, does like you're the face of something. Like, at some point you're gonna have to do media. Like, maybe not now because there's so many other outlets for companies to communicate to people, but like you had, like Vince had to do media at one point, and he was not good at it.
And I don't know if he was ever good at, like, every example that they bring up, the Donahue situation, the Katayan interview, the Bob Costas interview, they are train wrecks. Like, all of them
are bad.
All of them are so bad. And this is a guy who's like leading this huge company. He's very, you know, very much responsible for hundreds of people.
That never has to answer to anyone. So now you want me to come up here and you're gonna question me? like to him, that's just like, wait, what is happening right now? Like, I'm gonna go back to my world, the WWF, where no one questions me. Like, what
Smacking
the fuck is
papers out of
happening?
hands and
The fuck?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
ridiculous.
It's definitely behavior that's like, yeah, he definitely feels like he doesn't have to answer to somebody. That's spot on. Exactly. You can tell just in his energy, the way he approaches things, and how he physically tries to intimidate people too. You know, like the way he scoots up in the seat against Bob Costas, like, and tries to just like show him like I'm bigger than you, and if I want to, I can strangle you right now. All intimidation tactics, obviously, to compensate for the stuff, you know, that people are challenging him on, which he never really liked to be challenged, especially publicly. But that Rita Marie story, it's crazy, because I think one of the things too that came up several times, and Vince kind of alluded to this himself, and they touch on it too with the Attitude Era. You know, oh, it was a different time, and we know that things have changed, and it was much worse back then. And Krista, I want to ask you, you know, at a certain point, like, yes, it was a different time. Values were different. Vince said this himself, and society was different. But when we fast forward and we evolve as people, as we come to like a new sensibility and a new realization, like, oh, that probably was a terrible thing. When does one become responsible and accountable for how they might have treated somebody? Because Vince, he never owns up to that. In fact, he said it at one point, like, oh, it wasn't rape, but if it had been, the statute of limitations ran out, which is just another wild ass statement that he made in his documentary too. So
wow.
Jesus Christ. Oh my God, Vince. I think, see, Vince grew up in a time where taking accountability came in the form of a payout. Hush money. Like, we're not going to sit here and go to a blog. We're not going to sit here. Well, not a blog. Go to a news column or reporter, the cops. I'm just going to pay you out, and you're either going to decide to stay to work with me, or you're going to leave with this money, and then I never hear from you again. So even him now saying if it was rape, the statute of limitations is up, makes me believe that, one, you knew what you were doing. You knew that she was not lying. And even if you were to admit it right now, depending on what state you're in, because these laws are changing every day now, you can probably not be held accountable for your actions. Somebody like Rita, which I've heard before, I felt like I heard a glimpse of it when we were watching, when that Dark Side of the Ring episode came on with the plane ride from hell, or the 9 Lives of Vince McMahon, whichever one. I've heard it before. But for the public to just shun her for doing her job, and this is why a lot of women are not even believed to this very day, because even the stewardess on the flight from plane ride from hell, she was just doing her job. She wasn't enticing anybody. She wasn't being flirtatious. She was literally serving them drinks, walking up and down like she's supposed to. And she got cornered in a back room by, I don't know which wrestler. I can't remember. So Vince grew up in a time where accountability was payout. I think it was Flair. It makes sense. It makes sense. Yes, because Flair flashed, and yes. So Vince grew up in a time of accountability means a payout. So I don't think he's ever going to own up to that or any other woman that he sexually assaulted. Sable sued twice for sexual assault, and then they turned into a storyline for when she came back. Vince didn't care. As long as the money I dished out to you is coming right back to him, recouping it right back, I don't care. Like, you can say whatever you want. But the interesting fact about this lawsuit and stuff now, he's not fighting back. He's not putting any money out, as they touched on. But he grew up in a time of accountability, so he's not going to, of accountability with payout, so he's not going to sit here and admit, like, oh yeah, I did do this to her, and her. Or this person and that person and that person. Look, it took Hogan 84 years to admit that he snitched. Vince gonna have to be on his deathbed, or like his hand gonna be coming up out the grave with a note saying, "Yeah, I did this, but now you really can't do nothing now because I ain't here."
Exactly. Des, what was your reaction when he said that statement where he said it wasn't rape, but if it had been rape, the statute of limitations ran out, especially considering that at the end of this episode, what they did, I also like this, at the end of every episode, they gave an update on the status of every lawsuit that's been, thrown against him. and they said that a new state in New York basically lifted the statute of limitations last year, and he paid her out last year, just in 2023. So this all becomes a full circle thing. But what were your thoughts when he said that statement?
Um, Vince was also funny about this documentary is he was constantly contradicting himself all the time. So that's all I thought about it at the time. Like, oh, you can't be serious. Like the beginning of the documentary, for the whole documentary, we're sitting here talking about, man, the line between, Vince and Mr. McMahon are two completely different lines. I'm clearly not that guy. One's more exaggerated. And then by the end of the documentary, he's like, I don't know which one is which. The line's kind of blurred. I don't know. You know what I mean? And that's kind of all I thought in that moment was like, man, y'all been contradicting yourself this entire time. And you can't, there's only so much we can say listening to you that we can take as fact or something that makes sense. And that was definitely one of them. I was like, no, you actually wilding right now, bro. It's just another contradictory statement to come out of his mouth.
Yeah, I felt often he was trying to tell us things in just so many words. He didn't want to say them outright. That's just not his character. But one of probably the thing that stuck out to me the most was something that came up. I think it was in episode 4 where he was like, sometimes you say things that you don't actually feel or mean, but you say it to control thought. And that's what I do as a businessman. And it's like, oh, that's what it is. Like you are purposely, it's manipulative. It's misleading. Like you do that. And that's wrestling. And that's the funny thing about it. He's become so ingrained in this world in which he lives out the idea of, they bring it up, kayfabe, maintaining the illusion, saying things that aren't real, pushing the lines of reality. That's just a thing that he actually lives out, so that he probably does not really know the difference between himself and Mr. McMahon. He probably has lost all sense of what's true and what isn't, because I think at a certain point you kind of believe your own bullshit. And he's often believed a lot of the bullshit that he says, especially when people challenge him about it. Episode 3, screw job. So we referenced the Wendy Richter screw job, which started off the episode, and they concluded it with the Bret Hart screw job, of course. But the Wendy Richter incident was also just crazy because, again, it doesn't get the attention, nowhere near what we talk about with Bret and Shawn in Montreal in '97. Obviously, that's the most infamous of them all. But this Wendy Richter thing happened, 12 years before, basically showing, I think, everybody that works for Vince, like, hey, if you ever go down this path, if you decide to leave or whatever the case may be, if you're a champion, you better be ready to hand that belt over. And we didn't get much of Wendy's side. Like, she just said that she was heartbroken and devastated, and they never saw each other again. But P, what did you think about just like seeing that moment open up the episode and them actually showing like how they carried that whole thing out, and Vince justifying it like, hey, this is my property, it's my story. That's going to be something we do. Like, you're going to ultimately walk out without this championship, and we saw how it all unfolded in the episode.
I was excited that they started with that match because just being a women's wrestling advocate, of course this doesn't get talked about enough because it's the women's match, and it's like, oh well, and it was a mix of like the Fabulous Moolah with her bullshit. It's a mix of Vince being like, all this is mine at the end of the day. Like, that's my championship, that's my matches, like this is all me, and if I don't want something to happen, it's not going to happen, and if I want something to happen, it will happen. What I didn't appreciate, just knowing that story from like so many different angles, is that they did the typical misogynistic thing and painted Wendy Richter as problematic because she wanted to be paid worth what she was worth. Now she's a problem, and it's like, well, we had to do something because she was getting out of line, and he said something to the effect of like she got ahead of herself, or she became too much or something like that. And I was just like, that's so male coded, and like you didn't appreciate her stepping up for herself. And I'm glad that they opened up with that and just showed like what that does to a person, of just like your trust in people and what people give to Vince when you work for him. Like, you give everything. Like, Bret, I'm sure he's talked about it enough, but he still got emotional talking about it because like this is a man that he was loyal to for almost 20 years, like given his life, missed Christmases with his family, and you just betrayed me in a split second and had no issues, like no problem doing it. Like Vince talks about, screwing Wendy Richter like it's nothing. Like she thought something was going to happen. I needed something else to happen, and we did it, period. So it just showed you like who Vince was, but I'm glad they put shine on it, and I'm glad Wendy Richter was able to share her story.
Absolutely. the steroids trial was obviously going to be big talking points here. I mean, again, this is another topic you can make a whole docuseries about in and of itself, but it comes up, we walk through it, and ultimately, you know, we see that Hulk Hogan, they sort of reinforce the story that Hogan's testimony is ultimately like what got Vince off the hook and kind of got him out of water. And you know, just like doing research and like reading up on this over the years, like that turns out to be true. Like they definitely thought Hogan was going to be the star witness, but it turns out like he kind of flipped the script on him. He played the system and kind of gamed them, and Vince was able to walk away from it. But, you know, I think every wrestler here pretty much reinforces, hey, you know, this did happen on his watch, but Vince wasn't walking up to wrestlers saying like, hey, you need to take steroids right now and get bigger. Like he wasn't doing that. He wasn't prescribing them like Dr. Zahorian was accused of doing and selling them, which was obviously the illegal act of it. But we do see that, you know, obviously, again, Vince is going to be accountable for this stuff. But Des, I'll go to you. Like, what did you think about just like recounting that, and even like the story about the neck brace and how, you know, maybe he wore this to be a little bit more sympathetic and kind of play on the heartstrings of the jury that was inside of there. It's a very wrestling thing to do that if you come from that world and you know like what that looks like and what that implicates and means. But how did you feel about just how they handled this portion of the story and also Hogan's role throughout this whole thing?
I actually like this portion of the story. Again, this is one of those things that, of course, you know about and you know you see and you read about. But I don't know. I liked it. It felt like a good snippet again of everything that kind of went down in one big bubble to get me to understand. Oh, that's what happened. Oh, that's what's going on here. Because there is. I don't know. There was something that I kind of figured, you know, you were just talking about Hulk Hogan after his testimony. It kind of feels like that's when Vince gets off the hook. And then when Hogan comes back to WWE, there was something so funny. He said, he was like, me and Vince never talked about what happened. I'm like, yeah, because y'all low key did something for each other, wiped it away, and now there's nothing left to talk about. Now, I feel like when he came back, it was like, you already apologized for getting me off the hook back in the day kind of type thing. So I think it's really interesting thing to kind of watch in real time how that went down. But I think this dude Vince did not have to get that surgery at that very specific time. Like, come on, man. Even Vince was like, you know, it wasn't a thing. He definitely booked it. And what's so funny is when he recalls it, because there's a lot of things, of course, he's done so many things. To me, a lot of times when Vince says he might forget some things, I believe him. I'm like, you've done a lot of stuff in your life. I believe you forget some things. But he was like, no, I just happened to get the surgery. And in my mind, I'm like, you just forgot that you really were trying to play these people by having this neck brace on. That's really what it is. Because he definitely did that on purpose. So, but I think it was very introspective on that section of the documentary.
For sure. WCW, Monday Night War, another big part of this series, obviously. They go through the whole creation of Nitro, Ted Turner, the skits that WWF started to do at the time, the lawsuits with Razor Ramon and Kevin Nash. Like, they walk through all of that stuff. But again, the point that I want to go back to is the hypocritical nature of how this all played out, right? You know, and Eric Bischoff kind of being like one of the first people in this docuseries to call out, like, yeah, Vince he's telling you what he wants you to hear, and he's creating this story and fabricating it to protect himself and to make him seem sympathetic. Because Vince sits there when he's asked about it. He's asked about the similarities to what WCW did to him compared to what he did to the territories. And he's like, well, you know, Ted Turner's philosophy was to hurt the competitor, whereas I wanted to compete. And Chris Smith, the director, questions him like, well, wait a second, did Ted Turner not want to compete? And that's where Vince lays out the whole idea where it's like you have to put things out there that don't reflect the way you feel, but you just want to control thought. Krista, what did you think about just that whole section, you know, building up the WCW story, seeing them gain momentum, becoming huge, you know, kind of taking Vince's playbook to a certain extent, and then using that to kind of revolutionize the industry with Nitro, but then Vince kind of putting himself in a position to become like a victim almost compared to, again, what he did in the 80s to all the territories.
One, I think karma is a real thing. And that was just really karma for what Vince did to the territories in the 80s. Like, you essentially took food out of people's mouths. And Ted Turner and Eric Bischoff during the WCW days. Now, I was not a WCW girly. I looked at it as, okay, well, y'all taking all of the old people from WWF and putting them in your ring. Let's see what we can do. But they were sticking with the times that they were in at that moment. So it was easy to go back to WCW and watch all what they were watching or watch what they were doing, because nobody wants to see a gimmick of a clown. And like Doink the Clown was cool in the 80s, but when you're in the mid 90s and stuff are changing, like you still don't want to have a dentist fighting a crypt keeper, fighting a clown for a chicken that's hanging in the middle of a ring. Like, you understand, like nobody was for the gimmicks anymore. Everybody wanted to see like real raw wrestling, and WCW and Ted Turner provided that. They gave us a different outlook and a different aspect and a different point of view of what wrestling could really be with the entertainment, with the NWO. You know, although after a while it started to like go to shit and everybody and their mother was joining the NWO for no reason or whatever. But in the beginning it was just like, oh, my favorite wrestlers who I used to watch in WWF are now in WCW, and they do a more edgy, more of a rock star type situation that I'm drawn to. Like, this is what I'm loving right now. I don't know what WWF is doing. That's why they was beating the ratings for 83 weeks, because they weren't catching up. They weren't sticking to the times. And then for Vince to try to make himself the victim, it's again, it plays into that manipulation tactic. Like, okay, if they see me, they see I'm down and out, they see I'm trying to change things, you know, they will essentially give me that sympathy and jump on board. And as an audience, that's essentially what we did. The inmates started to run the asylum, D-Generation X, and now look at where they at now, running the asylum, whole like full force. So he knew what he was doing. And I want to piggyback real quick on the neck brace thing at the court, because on episode of Dark Side of the Ring, which I'm surprised they didn't bring it up in this documentary, Bruce Pritchard definitely said, like, after the trial and stuff was over, Vince took that neck brace off and was swinging it like he knew he didn't need it. Like, he really he was swinging it like. I'm just like, wow. So he knew what he was doing. Like, he knew, like, it was a manipulation tactic. So as we said earlier, Vince is a massive manipulator. So for him to get that sympathy vote and play victim after he was being beaten for 83 weeks, it was just like, okay. He laid and waited until his time was to come, and that's what he did.
Absolutely. P, I know one of the series that you do on Those Wrestling Girls is where WWE meets pop culture, and WCW in particular at that time was like very much like leading the charge of integrating pop culture into the product, you know, and making that just a mainstay. And as Krista alluded to, leveraging the realism, making it more in your face, just doing things that were unpredictable. I think she might have dropped off. We might have lost her there for a second. Actually, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that question about the WCW stuff. But as we like start to like wrap up on this. Oh, okay. No worries. Technical problems. We know how that goes. Well, Krista, I want to ask you, thinking just about like holistically the documentary, were there things that you felt like that they should have covered that they didn't? Because I do feel like that there were quite a few topics that they either had to move through really quickly or they just almost didn't acknowledge, really, just because there's so much in there. But I did find sometimes like, oh man, it would have been nice to hear a little bit more about that. Or maybe they did film some stuff and interview and talk about it, but it just didn't end up on the cutting room floor. Exactly. I heard this might have been like 10 episodes, but they had to shave it down to 6 for whatever reason. But were there any things that you felt like should have been talked about more throughout the series?
Yeah, I was very surprised to see that they talked about Chris Benoit more than Eddie Guerrero, like around that time. Like, I get why they spoke about Chris Benoit, and I don't know if he's taboo for your show, so I'm sorry for mentioning the name. But I just wanted to, you know, because aside from the CTE, and I love to see that. I love seeing Chris Nowinski in there talking about it, and you know, there were other factors to why these wrestlers died young. Eddie Guerrero was 38. He had a heart condition after he stopped using drugs. Like, you know, British Bulldog, back pain, drug addiction. Like, I wanted them to touch more on, you know, the use of drugs, even after the fact, like they were able to get paid while off of screen. You know, I wanted them to touch more on the fact of WWE sending their wrestlers to rehab to help them out. And as soon as they mentioned that part, I automatically thought about Jeff Hardy. The amount of times that Vince was just like, all right, we sending you to rehab. Like we can't have you in the ring falling out, tripping up, doing this, that, they're getting hurt or injured. Like we're sending you to specialists. Like I wanted to hear that side of him because Bruce Pritchard was like, yeah, Vince helped my wife get the best care when she was diagnosed with cancer. And that was like 24 years ago, however many years ago he said. But they didn't touch more on how helpful he is, how helpful like he's willing to, like the places he's willing to go. They really touched more on the crickets, like more of the shady dealings and business side of Vince, which I'm just like, all right, if there's more to this person, then it should have been more to that person. Like that's who we should have seen more. We should have seen that touching, loving side of Vince more so than the crooked, shady dealing side, the businessman of Vince.
Yeah, I do feel like that was lacking. Like it could have been a bit more balanced, and because there's a lot of stuff he has done. I mean, and it's obviously all super complicated, and we can acknowledge what he did, in the past couple of years, the controversies. But for a long time, he has helped people, and there's probably more intimate stories that people haven't talked about that could have came forward to present a bit of a more balanced view there. So I think that's definitely worth noting. P, we do got you back. Thank goodness we were able to figure out the technical stuff.
Yeah, my laptop just crashed.
Look,
but I'm back.
When the laptop says it's time to go, it's time to go. And
Been there.
Good thing for phone apps, so we good.
Thank goodness. The question I was asking you, that I wanted to get your opinion on was, you do a lot with the series that you do, the Where WWE Meets Pop Culture, and when Krista was talking a lot about WCW and how they were revolutionary and they were doing things that the WWF product wasn't doing at the time. I think WCW kind of, I don't know if they started it, but they definitely reinvented what it looked like for pop culture to be integrated into the product, right? And really kind of looking at what's happening in society and then putting that into what's happening on Nitro every Monday, making it more real, making it more in your face, the realistic, unpredictable nature of live TV, all of that stuff. How did you feel about, seeing that story retold here and just like what WCW contributed? Because even the doc that they dropped earlier this year, Who Killed WCW, is also like another, I think, a really good, sort of story about how they helped change the industry in the course of just like how things are communicated on television.
Yeah, it goes back to like revisionist history, because if you only listen to like WWE's side of the Monday Night Wars, like you would think WCW were like the only thing good they did was NWO, and then after that they were just like stupid, and WWE did everything right. But like Eric Bischoff was the first like owner boss character on TV, like way before Mr. McMahon. The use of celebrities was there because again, the mistake was that WCW was a television entertainment company trying to do wrestling. And so now they're thinking that way anyway. They're like, "Oh, it's the Tonight Show. Let's get Jay Leno. Let's get fucking what's his name?
Oh, Dennis Rodman.
Dennis Rodman, yes, who like missed out on finals practice to be at fucking Nitro. Like that, a lot of that was. Isn't that insane when you think about it?
He's wild.
But yeah, like I always like kind of knew just from this book called Nitro that like WCW did spearhead a lot of things. It's just that Vince adapted it and did it better. You could say the same with the territory model. Like he was like, "Oh yeah, this is cute. Oh yeah, doing wrestling business, that's cute." He's like, "Okay, I'm gonna just do it better." Another interesting thing that I want to touch on before was the two USA Network executives that were talking heads on it, which was amazing because you never heard from them before. And I loved hearing it from just a pure corporate executive perspective, where this was one of our, business units in the company. And this was just another brand that we had to oversee, and hearing them talk about how they felt about some of the content and how they had to tell them to like stop with the Ted Turner beef because like that's a friend of ours. Like we don't want no shade. Like we're competing with them, but you guys are going a little below the belt, and that's not really like what we want to do. And I just thought that was just so interesting. And also like female TV executives in the 90s.
Wow.
Really
Yeah.
Unheard of.
cool to me.
Yeah,
But
unheard of.
it was interesting seeing them touch on some of that stuff with WCW.
Yeah. I think I think it was Kay Koplovitz, you know, who at USA, she said, you know, about the steroids trial, like if they lost, if Vince lost, we probably would have gave up Raw. Like that would have been it,
Mhm.
you know, and I don't think I've ever heard that. And that in and of itself changes everything. There's
It
so
makes
many
so much
moments.
sense too.
Right, exactly. You know, that was a real thing. And
It's like, you bad for business, bro. My business.
right.
Like, not your business, but my
As,
business too.
as much
Exactly.
as much as I hate him, did Hulk Hogan save
I
WWE?
mean, in certain
Like
respects,
he did.
that
He
is,
did it. Yeah,
yeah.
he definitely
Kinda did.
saved. He did one good deed. Okay. No, but he did in
Everybody
retrospect.
good for
Like,
one.
Everybody gets one. Yeah,
Everybody
everybody
gets
good for one. Yeah.
but no, in retrospect, like he did save what we know and love today as Monday Night Raw. Like if it wasn't for him speaking
Yeah.
up, we wouldn't have Monday Night Wars. We wouldn't have had the likes of Taker, Steve, and Stone Cold Steve Austin, because if you remember, they were in WCW in the beginning. They got fired and went to WWE. We wouldn't have had The Rock. We wouldn't have had, you know, WWE would probably still have been a small territory, probably just restarting itself in an attitude era, and it wouldn't have been as big as it's gotten. So I guess Hulk Hogan, you did your big one. I guess.
Did that one. There's a lot of butterfly effects though. Like you can, I mean, there's so many
There
situations
is.
where I was like, if that went one direction left, if it made one left turn, everything. Like if Vince hired Eric Bischoff when he showed up to do that audition,
When he was announcing, yeah.
when he was announcing, what would that have meant? Because you know now Bischoff doesn't become this young sort of industry tycoon in wrestling to kind of change the face of, you know, what things look like on the Monday night standpoint. I mean, there's loads and loads of instances like that throughout the entire documentary. Last big portion here, Montreal Screwjob, of course. I just got to first and foremost say the Bret Hart stuff I loved. I thought it was incredible. Bret is one of my favorite people to watch talk about anything because he is somebody that I would never suspect of lying. He always feels like he's being 100% honest. But we all know the story. We all know how impactful it was, and ultimately how it led to the creation of the Mr. McMahon character. And, you know, I think, again, the Wrestling with Shadows doc is another terrific, you know, piece of work to look at, to really look at this, you know, on a more granular level. But to see, you know, sort of Bret retell that story was interesting here, to talk about, you know, what he was going through. And then ultimately Vince helping him to make the decision to jump to WCW for the money. You know, Vince admitting, like, I gave you a contract that I can't even afford. Like, this was stupid of me. Let me show you how to get more money out of WCW. And even Shane points out, like, oh, he had to show him the loopholes. And then we see it all go down. We see how they have to maintain the lie. You know, we see Triple H come in here and say, like, he's the one that kind of said, like, yeah, fuck this. If he's not going to do business, we'll do it for him. Sean, obviously, on the other side of it all. It's a crazy story. You know, time and time again, it almost never gets old, you know, to kind of hear how this went down. But Des, I'll go to you, just like the impact again of this one, right? Like if Bret Hart, you know, doesn't go to WCW, like if they somehow were able to work this out, do we ever get the Mr. McMahon character? Like, is that even a thing that happens? Because I think that these are also intrinsically tied in. There's so many, you know, sort of webs that come from just this one incident alone. Did that get you to thinking about just like how this could have gone in a very different direction if just one decision or one conversation, you know, maybe kind of changed the course of history?
Yeah, for sure. And you know, there is so much there. Because without Mr. McMahon, like you said, there's so much that just does not go down in wrestling history, and we don't get the whole McMahon family. We don't get no Shane jumping off of things. We don't get no Stephanie. We don't get Triple H and Stephanie to get
Austin
like
McMahon,
it's just all
you know.
like there's a ton of stuff in there we just simply do not get. And even thinking about just Bret in general, going to, you know, WCW, what does that even, you know, I don't know, look like without the screw job? It's just I guess a weird thing to think about. Like you said, so many different butterfly effects, and it's really hard to see what would even happen. And it's funny because the first thing I go to in my mind is something unsuccessful. You know what I mean? Like I know we're talking, that's just how I have to think about it. Like, dang, if that doesn't happen, none of these other good things happen. But I'm like, I don't know if something else good could have happened because of that. And, one of the things about the Montreal Screwjob that is like, I don't know, still weird for me is Sean and Triple H knowing about it. It's just like, oh man, y'all knew exactly what was going to go down, and then lied to Bret Hart's wife that you didn't know about it and you couldn't tell anybody about it. But again, here we are in this documentary telling all the beans, that everybody know, or that they knew about it. So yeah, man, it's just weird thing, I think, to come into terms with that. I have no idea what it would have looked like if that didn't happen.
Krista, that footage of Martha Hart backstage looking dead at Triple H and saying, "What goes around comes around, Hunter. Like, just be careful. What goes around that it gives me goosebumps to see stuff like that, because I don't want to put anything out there, but we know what happened, throughout the years. We know, like, yeah, stuff could look real bad for you, if you put energy out there, that you do wrong by people, you lie, whatever it may be. I mean, you can speculate about that all day long, but how did you feel about seeing that and just kind of, I guess recontextualizing, what it means for everybody involved and how it, again, it created this domino effect of all these things that came after it?
Okay, so again, I don't know, for out of those wrestling girls, I feel like I'm like the historian, because I would literally go back and watch all of these things. So those clips are not new to me. Those are old to me. Like, I've seen those before. So for her to sit here and be like, when Sean was like, "So help me God, I swear to God," and she's like, "Well, God gonna strike you down," because I knew that you knew. Like, it was that woman's intuition. Like, she knew that's something, like, she already knew, like, the relationship between Bret and Vince was shaky because Bret wanted more money. Vince wasn't trying to give up more money. WCW had this contract on the table, and Bret was standing on his morals. Like, I'm not going to sit here and drop the belt to somebody who's an asshole, to somebody who really doesn't care about the business, to somebody who's really just all about drugs, sex, and rock and roll in this sense, or whatever, who's really not going to be safe with anybody in the ring, or, who's not going to really take in regard and hold this title like I do. So for Vince to sit and screw him over after Bret doesn't help him put the sharpshooter on the right way in the middle of the ring, and for Martha to go in and say, "Yeah, like, I already knew, like, I know that y'all know." So it was a shock for me when I first found out, like, they really knew, the definition of kayfabe. Like, they really knew how to, if Vince was going to take the brunt of all of that. And he ultimately did. He got knocked out by Bret backstage. Like, I feel like that's some of the best footage I've seen. Vince's hair all messed up, he all dizzy, can't really walk properly, come out with a black eye. Like, you got what you got. Sometimes karma works instantly, other times it takes its time. But essentially, listen, karma's my girl. Essentially, you know, as you said, it would have been a butterfly effect. Like, I don't think that would have been. It wouldn't have been another perfect time for Vince to come out as Mr. McMahon after that. For Bret Hart, and it was sad because Bret Hart's career kind of went down the drain after that when he went to WCW, and he got injured by Goldberg, and him being speared on that metal door that nobody's told him about under the ring. Like, essentially, it was the lesser of two evils, and the best evil at that time was winning. But yeah, like, Martha stood her ground, and she knew. Like, she knew. Like, you're not gonna sit here and lie and say you don't know. Like, don't lie to me and say you don't know. You knew.
P, anything you want to say about the Montreal Screwjob section here? Again, a story we've all heard many times, but again, just like seeing Vince stand his ground, reinforce, like, I did this for the business, I'll do it again any day of the week, it doesn't matter. But Bret, obviously, I think you alluded to it earlier, feeling just betrayed, giving him 14 years of his life, missing like what a day, I think, in those 14 years, and just worked his ass off for a guy that he looked up to, and then ultimately, was betrayed by in the end.
Yeah. It was interesting hearing it more from Vince's standpoint, not in a kayfabe way, because he addressed it as Mr. McMahon, but it was nice to just hear him talk, like, candidly about it, especially, like, after so many years have passed. I think another interesting thing, and I don't know if it's in the first 3 episodes, was the cut of all these wrestlers referring to Vince as a father figure, because that is and I'll wait for you. I don't want to say too much because I know you're going to cover the other half, but that's huge. because
Yeah.
wrestling is obviously a very male dominated industry, and Vince being this diabolical, Mr. McMahon, and then you literally have a cut of like 10 wrestlers. Like, he was a father figure. I consider him a dad. I tried to impress him. I did this. I did this. It's such a like, which is, again, we really will never know who Vince McMahon is,
Yeah.
So I think him even talking about the screw jobs and feeling like it was a business decision at the end of the day, and then some people feeling like he's just a terrible person, some people feel like he had to do what he had to do, and all this stuff, and Brett forgave him ultimately. So it was just interesting hearing from like Vince in that way, for sure.
Absolutely. This was certainly the perfect midway point, I think, for the series to transition into the second half of it. But with all of that said, we're going to close out this conversation and finish off here. I want to thank you both so much for joining us today, Queen
Yes,
PR and
yes.
Krista B, for hopping on to talk about this Mr. McMahon docuseries. It was such a pleasure to have you on. Before we let you go, can you just let the people know, if they don't know, where they can find you, what you have going on with those wrestling girls, the things that they can look out for? Just let the people know where they can find y'all if they want to tune in for more stuff.
You want to go, P?
You can
You want me to go?
find I can go. You can find me at Queen3_PR on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, everywhere. And of course, those wrestling girls on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, everywhere. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, hit that bell for notifications. We go live at least once a week. And just stay tuned for everything we have coming.
And you can follow me, Miss Krista B, MS_KRISTAB_ on Instagram, MS_KRISTAB on Twitter. Also the same on TikTok. As P said, please make sure you follow those wrestling girls everywhere. Subscribe to everything. We come out with new content almost every day on our YouTube. And we just want to say thank you all for those who already subscribed and getting our subscribers and viewership up. We love you all. Stay tuned, because we do have some special things in the works for those wrestling girls, because we are embarking on 6 years. So we want you guys to be a part. So please stay tuned to see what we have going on, and make sure you follow, like, and subscribe.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you both again for hopping on today. That's all we have for this episode of Two Black Nerds. Definitely tune in to the next episode. We're going to be talking about episodes 4 through 6 of the Mr. McMahon docuseries and breaking it down with some other special guests. That episode will be dropping very, very shortly here. But